Para este cuarto panel nos acompaña Sergio Sarmiento, reconocido escritor y periodista mexicano. Trabajó como redactor en Enciclopedia Británica Publishers Inc. y ha escrito para grandes periódicos como The Wall Street Journal y Los Angeles Times. Ha publicado en más de 20 periódicos mexicanos en los que actualmente se encuentra su columna Jaque Mate. Sergio, es un placer y un honor tenerte aquí el día de hoy con nosotros. También nos acompaña el profesor Thomas Straupa, miembro activo de la Fundación Friedrich Naumann para la Libertad desde 1994 y miembro de la Junta Directiva de la Fundación. Fue presidente del Archivo de Economía Internacional de Hamburgo y posteriormente jefe del instituto. También fue profesor de Economía en la Helmut Schmidt University en Hamburgo. En el 2009 fue galardonado con la beca Helmut Schmidt de la Fundación Zeit en el Transatlantic Academy en Washington, D.C. Antes de iniciar este panel, quiero comentarles que será presentado en inglés, pero en el video completo del Congreso que subiremos a redes sociales podrán verlo con subtítulos. So now, it's my pleasure to hand over to Mr. Sergio Sarmiento. Sergio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with RELIAL and to talk a little bit about what we can expect in Latin America after COVID. We know that the pandemic has been extremely harsh on everyone. At the same time, we know that there is no pandemic that doesn't have an end, and we know that we'll have an end. How ready are we? What are the countries that can actually take advantage of this crisis? What are the countries that are best prepared to resume their economic growth after the end of the pandemic? I've seen a lot of analysis on this. Professor Thomas Straup of the University of Hamburg has prepared a presentation on this. And what I suggest we do, Professor, is for you to offer the presentation. Maybe we can talk about it. I can make you some questions, and we can have some questions from the people who are watching us, and then consider in depth what are the perspectives for Latin America after COVID. I understand that you have a PowerPoint presentation. Would you care to share it with us?
Thank you so much. And thank you also the organizers for having me in this Congreso Virtual. I think this is a perfect occasion to train us further with new technologies. And it's a pleasure to be invited and to share some views about COVID and the consequences with you. And so thank you so much. As Sergio, you have said, I have prepared a short PowerPoint presentation that I would like to share with you. And hopefully you can see now the screen and that what I have prepared. And I think I would like to start with remind you that actually this crisis has really hit Latin America the most of all the different regions in the world. And you can just see this with the comparison of the growth rates that are expected by the International Monetary Fund in its World Economic Outlook. And if you are going to make the calculation between the growth rates of 2020 to 2019 and to 2021 compared to 2020. And if you are going to compare this situation, then you see that no other region will suffer so much as Latin America will do. It is a minus of about 8% this year, and it will just be a slow recovery next year with 3.6. And if you are going to substitute 3.6 from minus 8.1, you have a 4 to 5% decline in the aggregated GDP, meaning in the gross domestic product, what is somehow really a shock. So I thought in my presentation, I'm not going to give you insights that you have much better as insiders than I do. What I will do is just to have a look from the outside to Latin America, asking myself, how could we explain that this area in the world has been hit harder than all the other parts in the world economy. And it's also valid in both regards, one in the human terms and the other one in economic figures. In both dimensions, it's really exceptionally bad how Latin America has been hit by COVID-19. And I have another bad news for you, and that's it, that probably it will not be a fast recovery. It will be a kind of slow recovery. And this is the long-term trend for the GDP. And here per capita in international dollars, that means you see the purchasing power. So you have a real data and not just a nominal data. And that shows you that probably we lost half of a decade's progress in 1.5 year. So that's really dramatic. And it will last probably 4 to 5 more years to come back to the level of welfare, because here it's a GDP per capita data, to come back to the same welfare level as we have reached before in Latin America. So to compare why Latin America has been hit so hard, we could see two reasons. One is that in Latin America, most people still work in areas where you require close physical proximity and where you could not so easily shift economic activities to online speeches as I do it right now, to home office as most Europeans do right now or Americans do, to homeschooling as other areas have done. So it is a kind of structure of the economy that is very much harmed and very much somehow specifically treated by COVID-19. And the second reason is that in informal sectors, of course, it's even more true that you could not substitute personal contacts by online activities. That's specifically true with all kinds of household services. Household services, per definition, more or less, rely on personal contacts. And of course, that goes in hand with the always quoted, what I think is still true, observation that weak institutions somehow lead to weak public health systems, what of course makes then the infection cases even more damaging. So let me now come to what we will discuss later on. What is seen from the outside, from an outsider, probably the conclusion. What would I advise politics and politicians to undertake to probably get a little bit out of the mess of COVID-19? First point, I think, and that is also European and American insight that we have gathered over the last months, is that no risk is the big risk. That means what we see is that we have somehow to balance the direct health risks of corona against the indirect risks that somehow are the consequences of corona politics, of the attempt to somehow overcome the direct health risks. You undertake fiscal stimuluses, monetary impacts. You have some other instruments like the lockdown or the shutdown of the economy that may probably also provoke costs and risks, because at the very end of the day, you need a healthy economy to finance a healthy healthcare system. Second point, probably in a liberal context, this is a little bit of surprise. I think that in this times, you need a kind of fiscal support to cover some of the most severe damages, because I think that is somehow the equivalence rule we know from macroeconomics, that the taxes of today, that the subsidies of today are the taxes of tomorrow. But here I would turn it around, that the public expenditures today are the basis for taxing people and firms tomorrow. Third point, I think that it's not over yet. What we see in Europe is probably the lesson that has to be learned in other areas of the world, that after the first wave, a second and probably a third wave are expected to come, and it comes until we may probably have a vaccine, that we could have a medical treatment to avoid further infections, but till then, other waves will be to be expected. And so that means that probably if we are going to have this kind of fiscal stimulus, we should somehow support and help people and firms and enterprises, but it should be a kind of a contract, a commitment that the fiscal help of today lead to consolidation tomorrow. That this is somehow, that in later times there will be a price to be paid for the help of today. We have specifically to be careful with banks, because most firms probably do not have a kind of solvency. They have a liquidity problem. It's not a solvency problem, it's a liquidity problem. They are basically more or less sound, but they cannot somehow fulfill the liquidity requirements. They cannot pay bills. Thirdly, and probably specifically interesting, is that the way out of the crisis should go hand in hand with the strengthening of institutions, because the empirical evidence shows that areas with weak institutions are specifically strongly harmed by COVID-19. And that leads me to the very famous proposition you all know by Hernando de Soto, that probably make the informal sector kind of formal could be a good idea. Because in the informal sector, you have a perfect economic world. And if we could transfer the informal sector to become formal, that would be probably the first step towards a kind of normalization of strengthening institutions. What I would like to add further, and what probably is really specific for Latin America, seen from a European perspective, is that somehow inequality is a kind of constant and ongoing problem. And COVID, of course, did not lower the gap. It has increased the gap within the different groups of a society and of an economy. And this is specifically true with regard to the middle class. My evaluation, my judgment of what happens, what's going on in Latin America, is that it's not so much anymore a question of poverty, a question of mass unemployment, a question of kind economic, really bad or even worse situations economically. it's much more that probably the middle class does not get what it thinks it has somehow the merit to get it. That the middle class does not feel be treated equally and does not see to have a fair chance to really climb up the ladder from a dishwasher to somehow a real upper class person. And that leads me to the last suggestion, that we should probably talk about the difference between the liberal and the libertarians. European liberalism is different from American libertarian. And it means that probably in a liberal understanding of Europeans, and I think this is specifically true in times of Corona and post-Corona, the state will have to play a role to overcome all the mess of the last couple of months. It needs a kind of a new social contract between the private area and the public area, between state and markets, between somehow what is the role of a strong but slim state and what is the role of a strong private sector. And that leads me to my very last point, where I'm looking at what should this new social contract care. And I would say it should look to protect markets, not business. It should go to maximize the welfare of people, not the profits of firms. So thank you for listening to my introduction. And Sergio, I'm now looking forward to a hopefully very interesting discussion and very interesting questions. Thank you so much for them.
Thank you, Professor Straubhaar. Everyone has been looking at the COVID situation, and various countries have taken a number of very different measures to try to combat COVID. Some countries have been very successful, and some countries haven't been successful. In Latin America, we have very few countries that have been sanitarily successful. And in fact, we have a number of countries that have taken extreme lockdowns of the population. And the bad news for the people who've taken these measures is that they haven't worked. Among the countries of Latin America, we have a few of the countries in the world that have been most hardly hit by the pandemic. For example, Brazil. Brazil has 744 deaths per 1 million population. I'm using always deaths per 1 million population because we're going to be comparing countries that are large and countries that are small. 744. This is a country that was extremely lax in the application of sanitary measures. In fact, we know that President Jair Bolsonaro didn't really believe in the gravity of the sickness, and so he took a very nonchalant attitude. So they have 744 deaths per 1 million population. But what happened with countries that were extremely concerned and that took extreme measures of lockdown? There's Argentina, for example. It had 663, or it has up until today, 663 deaths per 1 million population. Colombia, which had a partial lockdown, but very little central state power to impose the curfew on everyone, had 602. The difference is interesting. In fact, Argentina has, up until this point, more deaths per 1 million population. Chile also had a very extreme lockdown. They have 736 deaths per million population, almost the same as Brazil. Mexico had a a sort of flexible attitude. We had an economic lockdown for most companies, but it wasn't forcefully enforced. And we have a situation right now in which we have 698 deaths per 1 million population. When we compare all of these figures, we find out something very surprising. Lockdowns don't work. What actually works is probably having a good health system. The one very successful case in Latin America is Uruguay, and Uruguay didn't have a lockdown that was stronger than that of Argentina. However, it has only 16 deaths per 1 million population. What was the difference with Uruguay? First, they had a lot of tests per person, 89,416 tests per person. And this is actually much more than other countries in Latin America. For example, Mexico had very few tests, probably because the government itself was not really concerned about tests. They wanted to not to apply tests. They thought that the tests themselves weren't very useful to understand what was going on in a country. So basically what Mexico did is to apply very few tests, 18,000. So this is almost just a portion of what Uruguay was doing. What's going to happen economically? And this is very important. We're seeing some countries applying very important injections of government money into the economy. That has been the recipe, or this is the recipe that is being used in North America and the United States, in most of Western Europe. And we still don't know what the consequences are going to be. The traditional economic recipe tells us that if we inject government money to the economy, then we're going to have a faster recovery. We're not actually sure up until this point. We have extremes. Countries like Argentina and Brazil are actually using, and Chile are actually using a lot of government money in comparison to the GDP to try to promote a quicker reaction of the economy. Mexico is not doing that. In fact, Mexico's recipe, even though Mexico has a leftist populist government, has been not to use government money to try to generate a recovery of the economy. What's going to happen next year? We don't know yet. The Mexican government is actually forecasting a 4.6% growth in 2021, but I know of no serious economist who believes that can actually be achieved. But what we're finding out, at least in Mexico, and in fact in other countries, is something that Professor Straucher is pointing out. One of the biggest obstacles to productivity growth in Mexico and Latin America is the fact that we have too many obstacles to being productive in the formal economy. In Mexico, what we're seeing right now is, in fact, that the government is taking new measures to prevent the formal economy from operating successfully. They're giving a lot of facilities for the informal economy to continue doing business, but they're actually clamping down on the formal economy. For example, the Mexican president is introducing a bill to outlaw outsourcing of employees. This would actually make it a lot more difficult for some private companies to be productive, to be competitive, because they'll have to contract people probably at very low wages that they don't really need, and it would be far more competitive to actually contract these people from outside sources. But in any case, my feeling at this point, and we'll have to see what happens with the economy next year. Right now, every economy in Latin America is facing a major collapse. We'll have to see whether Mexico is more or less successful than countries that are actually using government money to promote an artificial growth of the economy next year. And we'll have to see what happens with countries that that actually have fewer obstacles to the formal economy. It's interesting to note that Peru is a country that is facing the toughest situation right now, both in terms of the number of deaths per 1 million population, which is 1,036, significantly more than the 700s and 600 that you actually see in the rest of Latin America. But it's also the country that has faced up until this point, and of course it is too early to tell what's going to happen next, the biggest collapse of the economy. What's going to happen to Latin America? My guess at this point is that the countries that use government money, that actually contract debt to increase government spending, are going to have a short injection of vigor in the economy, but it won't last very much, because this money actually ends after a little while, and the countries of Latin America don't have that much money, not like the countries of Europe, for example, that are having economic injections of more than 30% in some cases of GDP. Mexico, just to give you an idea, is injecting 0.4% of GDP into the economy to try to generate an economic recovery. But the impression that I have is that those countries that actually lift obstacles to spending, that lift obstacles to private investment, are the countries that are going to have the fastest recovery, and that's something that we're going to have to see. At this point, the countries in Latin America have been very unsuccessful in facing the pandemic, especially if we compare ourselves with countries like South Korea or Singapore, or even countries like China, that using a very questionable strategy of actually preventing people from exercising their economic freedoms, have actually been successful in stopping the pandemic, although they've actually violated human rights in a widespread manner. But the big experiment that we're gonna see in 2021 is whether the countries that actually follow Hernando de Soto's advice, to quote Professor Strauchar, are the countries that actually have the fastest recovery. And we're going to see how Keynesian economics actually operate in a situation like this. We're seeing, of course, a collapse of the economy, not because there was a lack of money in the economy, not because there was because there wasn't enough demand. We're actually seeing a collapse because the demand collapsed for reasons that had nothing to do with the supply of money or government spending. I'm not quite sure what that's going to mean for Keynesian economics, but it's going to be a remarkable experiment. One of the lessons we're learning is that the countries that have good health systems, in Europe, for example, this is very evident when we compare the situation in Germany with the situation in Italy. And it's clear that even though Germany had many contagions, they didn't have the terrible situation that we saw in Italy or that we saw in Spain in terms of deaths. In most of Latin America, we don't have a good health system. So we're seeing that the data for the number of deaths per million population are extremely high, with the exception of Uruguay. It helps to have a good health system. That's one field in which the government can actually use public money in an efficient way if they want to do it. When you don't do it right, and this is what happens in Argentina or in Chile or in Mexico, you're going to have extremely high death rates in a pandemic situation, even though you might have similar contagion rates that other countries that have much lower death rates. But we're actually seeing an enormous experiment. And I think it's an experiment that is going to show us that Keynesian economics are not quite as successful when you apply them in a situation such as this, and that lifting obstacles to private investment might be the right way to go. Maybe if the countries in Europe, maybe the countries in Latin America were more keen on preventing the normal bureaucracy that doesn't allow investors, especially small and medium-sized investors, to use their money to fill market vacuums. And right now there are all sorts of market vacuums that are being created. We might eventually get to see that the countries that provide a bit more freedom are going to do better than the countries that inject more government money into the economy. But I think that's something that we're going to have to see in the next few months, in the next couple of years. I don't know if we can actually go to a Q&A session. We already have a good 20 minutes to do that.
If there are no questions for the moment, are there questions for the moment? Otherwise, I would like to comment a little bit on what you have said. Probably I start with saying that in most points, I fully agree with you, of course. This is going parallel with my understanding of the crisis. I would like to add probably that the crisis is unique. It is complex. Much or many things go about the timing. When are we doing the right things? This is still, for me, an open question, because as I've tried to say, you have somehow to balance the immediate impact and the long-term consequences of all what you are going to do in politics. I agree, of course, that all you do for the private sector is basically the stronger stimulus, has the stronger long-term impact. The point that I would like to stress again is probably that this time is different with regard to the danger for many, many people, for a lot of people, many persons, for many firms, that they somehow could not survive tomorrow. Yep. Because the shock is so tremendous that even if you are going to lift barriers for investments, they could not invest because they are not going to survive tomorrow. So they need a kind of chance for the very short term to survive.
Professor Straufer, of the many things that a government can do with the money they have, what is the most efficient? What should we be doing? Should we be saving the banks, medium and small companies, or should we be providing credit? What should we, the governments, be doing at this point?
Actually, I think, to be honest, what is really unusual, what is really exceptional, at least for Germany, I advise the government not to give credits, but to give gifts. That they are not going to have a payback.
Just to give away money.
Give away money. This is unusual, but and I think this is somehow similar for Latin America. If you give credits today, then it lowers incentives for entrepreneurs, for small firms, for single person firms, because the credits of today will mean that they have to pay back the profits for the next 10 years, probably. So if you do not have a chance to get profits for the next 10 years, what is the ambition? What is the incentive then to become productive, to become a small entrepreneur? So that's my point, why I think it's really exceptional. It's from one day, it's a disruption. It's from one day to the other. No chance. And it is not a question of individual behavior. It is really, it is somehow random somehow. And it becomes specifically random once you have policy corrections, policy interventions, policy reactions to the direct impact of COVID. This is random. If you're going to have a lockdown, if you have a contact somehow barrier, then this is random. This is not something you can influence individually. So I think for the short run, I would be more generous as you do, probably. This is the single difference we have.
Yeah, I probably have a different attitude in that sense, but I'm always keen to learn. So it would be just given away. How do you decide which companies deserve it? And are you going to be rescuing weak companies as well as strong companies?
Very good point. And I think this is also something that is probably interesting for Latin America. In Germany, we will do that by somehow taking the balance sheets of the last 2-3 years and firms that have declared in their tax declaration profits, they will get more money than the others. So it is a link between the profitability of the last 3 years according to tax declaration. So if you have declared your taxes in a correct way, you are now getting the merits of it. You get now rewarded for your honesty to declare your balance sheets
How much does that cost, Professor Straubhaar? And how do you finance it? I mean, Germany is a very rich country and they can probably contract debt. They've been very frugal over the past few decades. But how much is it going to cost in Germany? And I'm thinking in terms of a Latin American country. To begin with, a Latin American country pays a lot more for new government debt than Germany. But how much do you think the German government is going to give away to companies?
The newest calculation that is just from yesterday from the Minister of Finance for the lockdown in November, he calculates a 5 to 10 billion euro. 5 to 10 billion euro. And of course, this is a new debt. This is a debt that is not being, it is a expenditure, a public expenditure that is not covered by current taxes. That is.
So in your opinion, this time is different and we should have government give away money to companies.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I don't know if anyone wants to
because again, in one sentence, the difference to other crises is it is not a solvency problem, it's a liquidity problem.
Okay.
And liquidity is the problem. If liquidity is the problem, you can solve the problem. If it's solvency, then you should let it go.
In a region like Latin America with so much informality, would you recommend the same solution?
Somehow, yes. That was my point. I think that in these times you have to rescue the mass of small and very small enterprises. Somehow, if you are not going to rescue the small and very small enterprises, you lose the middle class somehow. And I would say this is somehow much more tremendous than the negative long-term impacts, what you have correctly described. I mean, this is a risky strategy.
Would you also rescue firms that are to fail, big companies that might be in risk of collapsing, maybe, aerospace companies, airlines? Would you also rescue them?
Very good point. In my understanding of an economy and of economics, I would concentrate on small, very small, and self-employed firms. And the too big to fail argument, this is of course something that we have had in the financial market crisis in 2007, 2008, 2009. I think I would not care so much on the big firms. I would care on the small firms, knowing that of course the risk is high. If you let a big firm go bankrupt, then this is a risky strategy. But airlines, I'm afraid that once you start to subsidize them, you can never have an exit of such a strategy, because the airline companies, the whole business model of air mobility will have enormous difficulties in the future anyway. This was never a profitable business, actually. It was always a kind of state-driven business.
So it would be healthy for the economy if a few of the airlines, national airlines, just collapse?
sooner or later they will collapse anyway. So it's a question of when, it's a question of timing. When are you gonna somehow accept this strategy of the big firms?
I agree with you that just giving money to a company that is going to keep on losing money doesn't make sense, at least
that's my point.
Public money, yeah.
That's my point. In smaller enterprises, you have at least a chance that they will recover. And I think in Latin America, the small firms, somehow they have a good business model. They will survive in normal, regular times. The big aircraft or airline industries, they will not survive in the times to come anyway. So it's a question of timing. When are you gonna take this decision?
I have a number of questions in the chat. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. There's one person, Jörg Dennert, who asks if there are several waves and we always react with a shutdown. Isn't it better to think of a long-term strategy from the beginning, meaning no shutdowns and waiting for herd immunity like Sweden does? Well, that's a big question. And, we're not epidemiologists, but the point is that the very high rate of deaths in Sweden at first is not quite as high anymore, at least in comparison with countries that did lock down. But maybe it's too early to tell really what's going to happen. There's Daniela Ibanez asks, what are the structural weaknesses of Latin America aside from a lack of informality, or I suppose it's lack of formality? What is the role of the FNF, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Latin America, especially in Peru, in the upcoming election? Well, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation can actually answer that in a while. And Alejandra Inost asks, this time is difficult and many things in policy have a mix. If growth in economy, try to protect the environment. Angelica del Castillo, would you not say it is better to give money to small businesses? How do you do this when you are already facing huge debts? Iran Elizabeth Leeser, in the United States, the stimulus payments given during April through July, they need, people who get them need to pay taxes. And Diana Luna, what about investing more in the last decades? Many governments have shortened the health system in Latin America. What would you concretely suggest to strengthen the weak health system in the region? Well, we have a number of questions there. I don't know if you want to take any one of them, Professor Strauchar.
Yes, sure. At least I try, and probably I'm gonna ask for the support of Jörg Dennert if it goes about Peru and what we are doing in Peru. Probably he could intervene also directly. Let me start with the question about the Swedish case. I think this is an interesting case because what I think is what we could learn from the Swedish case is that there are alternatives at least, and we should really study very carefully the Swedish way, because to make it short, I would say the Swedish have somehow fulfilled a strategy that we know very well in economics. It's called the 80-20 strategy, that you try to reach with instruments with a small cost with a very big impact. And I think the Swedish have gone such a kind of way. You are not going to try to rescue everybody from an infection, but you try to optimize somehow the costs of intervention and the costs of infections. And I think this is a very clever way, to be honest, because I think if you try to go through the process in a logic sense, then what you see at the end, we have to search how we can immunize the whole population. And there are two ways. One is an artificial, that would be the best one, vaccination, but this takes time. And the other one is somehow like a controlled infection, I would say. And and the difficulty is, of course, that somehow how to balance these things. But I think the Swedish, I have a lot of sympathy for the Swedish strategy. Second point, and I would like to go to the question here. Probably I'll take the one about the health system. Mm-hmm. And I really think this is, again, something that you have to study very carefully, also in Latin America, that if you are going to shorten public expenditures in public infrastructure, education, health, some traffic, mobility, something like that, that you probably pay a higher price later on. But I think that in these times, there are a kind of public goods. That's the difference between the liberals in Europe and the libertarians in the United States, that I think there are good reasons for infrastructure being organized in a public way. It does not necessarily mean that the state has to run the business, but mm-hmm. somehow it is somehow the public responsibility to take care for public services. And I think this is what I would advise countries, that they somehow search for strong public service systems, not meaning that they have to run the business themselves. As
yeah, and we have examples like Canada, for example. And I used to live in Canada, or you used to live in Great Britain that has a similar system. Basically, you do have a public health system, but the hospitals are private. The physicians don't work for the government. They're private. They're in competition. They charge their fees, and the government runs a kind of an insurance system. But if you provide competition, if you preserve competition, then the system usually works better. I'm saying there's any perfect system for health or education in the world, but when there's competition, they do seem to work much better.
Absolutely. That was my point about if you have competition, if you have markets, that's fine. But if you are going to privatize public services and you get the public monopoly, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter whether the monopoly is public or private. And probably, I'm not sure, Jörg, whether you could intervene about what we are doing in Peru specifically. You are the expert. Otherwise, if you are not able to answer, I'll do it on my own, but I'm not sure whether I could do it as well as you do.
Well, I'm not an expert on Peru. What I see is that Peru has faced probably the heaviest toll, has paid the heaviest toll in sanitary terms and in death, in deaths per million population. But it has also had the largest collapse of any Latin American economy. We should be concerned. We should be taking a look at Peru, and maybe the reason, maybe the main reason for that is the fact that their public health system is so bad. That may be one of the reasons for that circumstance.
And I've just seen that Siegfried Herzog has answered in the chat in a note.
All right.
And probably you can go through it, that we can have another kind of question.
Okay, there's one question in the Q&A section of the Zoom, and the question is from Diana Luna. It says, in the region there has been a strong critique about the liberalization of the health system, as many governments have shortened the health systems in the last decades. What would you suggest concretely to the federal governments who are dealing with a weak health system? I have my answer, but Professor Straubhacht, what would your answer would be?
Again, I would say competition is for many things the best rule, and the best rule of thumb at least. And again, I think actually in the health system, you could have a mix between centralization and decentralization. I think the point is in the health system that you need a kind of specialization within the hospitals and within the treatment, and that somehow you are going to concentrate some specific knowledge and infrastructure, health infrastructure, hospital infrastructure in certain places, and going to specialize for other treatment and other illnesses and other operations in other hospitals. So competition first, organization second, I would say that is the point.
In fact, I totally agree with you. I think you can have a public system that has competition elements in it, and you'll have a better public system. In fact, having a public system and at the same time allowing competition from a private system, a private insurance system, can probably also work well. And that's what I think happens in countries that have have a better health system. I don't know the German health system very much, but I do know the health systems of other countries in Europe, and it's in of my own country in Mexico, and they work much better when you don't have a central health institute that is the big employer of all the physicians and the big employer of all the nurses. That usually doesn't work. But you can have a public system that has competition elements.
I just realized that the two people have asked about the environment. This is an interesting point, actually. Actually, in Europe and specifically in Germany, the condition to get public support in many cases is bound to invest the money in an environmentally sound way. That means that if you get this giveaway money, then you have to make your investments you are going to do with it in an environmental friendly way. So it's combined. You get public money, but you have to do it in a green way, a smart green way. And this is something that I think is a clever combination of two ideas. The one is to help people survive and firms survive, and on the other to probably speed up the transformation from traditional to green production processes.
Professor Thomas Straubhaar, thank you very much. And I want to thank this Congreso Virtual 2020, Activemos el Futuro. I want to thank RELIAL and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation that make this possible. And, it's important for us, for everyone to be talking, debating these issues. And so glad that we can do it, at least in a virtual way. And of course, this allows us to do it also, from our own countries, and it's a very good way of doing it. We're learning to do things in a more efficient way. That's also important. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure, really a pleasure.
Well, and
to everybody, and keep safe.
Keep safe, of course. Right? Anything else? Me parece que, pues, ahora, señores de RELIAL, ustedes nos despiden, me imagino, ¿no?
Sí. I just wanted to thank you very much, Mr. Sergio Sarmiento and Professor Straubhaar, for this amazing and interesting intervention. You are welcome, of course, to stay and join us for the closure of the Congress. Ahora haciendo switch de nuevo a español, y para cerrar este congreso me gustaría darle la palabra al director regional de la Fundación Friedrich Naumann para la Libertad en América Latina, Siegfried Herzog, cuya colaboración ha sido esencial para que este congreso sea posible. Adelante, Siegfried.
Muchas gracias, Brenda, y gracias a todos. Estamos al fin de nuestro primer congreso virtual, una experiencia rara. Nos falta, por supuesto, el intercambio personal, los abrazos, las pláticas sobre una comida o una copa. Pero del otro lado, creo que logramos de integrar más personas en un diálogo importantísimo sobre los desafíos grandes que enfrentan la región y el movimiento liberal en la región. Tuvimos paneles muy interesantes, muy ricos. Discutimos las nuevas movilizaciones de la izquierda en diferentes países, poniendo al riesgo las reformas económicas exitosas. enfrentamos verdaderamente un movimiento coordinado y necesitamos tomar esta situación en cuenta. Vemos un resurgimiento del populismo y del clientelismo y de ambos lados, de la derecha y de la izquierda, y este reto principal a una cultura política abierta. Una propuesta fue que RELIAL proponga su propio plan de gobernación de una manera liberal, ofrecer alternativas concretas, y creo que algunos de nuestros ponentes revirtieron a este punto, y es un desafío para RELIAL de trabajar sobre esta idea. Discutimos también las grandes potenciales de cooperación entre la Unión Europea y América Latina y los retos a la ratificación del acuerdo entre la Unión Europea y Mercosur, que demuestra una alianza negativa de la extrema izquierda y derecha en Europa contra el libre comercio, un peligro enorme para el futuro, sobre todo porque China está dispuesto a tomar este espacio libre. Discutimos también el desafío de la pandemia, las contradicciones de las políticas públicas y la dificultad de encontrar la mejor respuesta, dado las diferencias graves entre países y sus capacidades institucionales y a veces también sus culturas, que también influyen la respuesta a la pandemia. Enfrentamos también faltas de liberalismo en la región, concentrarse en la economía y olvidar a veces de reformar el Estado para ofrecer, por ejemplo, educación y salud de calidad, de politizar la burocracia y mejorar el profesionalismo y los servicios públicos. Finalmente, escuchamos una discusión extremadamente interesante entre nuestro invitado especial de Alemania, profesor Strauper, y Sergio Sarmiento, y muchas gracias a ambos, sobre lo que tenemos que hacer para salir bien de la crisis, con ideas que creo son muy interesantes y ideas que necesitamos quedar en nuestra cabeza. Estas discusiones y propuestas pueden armar el trabajo de RELIAL y el liderazgo de la nueva mesa directiva. Y al fin quisiera dar muchos agradecimientos. Muchas gracias a la mesa directiva 2018 a 2020 con su presidente Ricardo Gómez y la nueva mesa directiva 2020 a 2022 con la presidenta Berta Pantoja por una cooperación fuerte y profesional. A las 39 organizaciones de RELIAL en 17 países de América Latina que hacen posible que exista RELIAL. En especial a la presidenta de RELIAL, Berta Pantoja, y a Sergio Sarmiento por acompañarnos como anfitriones y activos promotores de este evento. A los 15 ponentes de los 4 paneles durante la mañana, muchas gracias a ustedes. Y también a los eurodiputados de ALDE y Europe Renew, quienes en todos los congresos de RELIAL siempre están presentes y dan más esfuerzo a esta idea que el movimiento liberal es verdaderamente global. Al final, muchas gracias también al equipo RELIAL que hizo todo esto posible, Silvia Mercado, Brenda Rodríguez, Karime Aguilera, con el gran apoyo de las colegas FNF, Jocelyn Bates y Naomi Hünecke-Braun. Y gracias también a mis colegas en la región que apoyan todo el tiempo a RELIAL. Al fin, quisiera dar un mensaje promocional, que todos siguen las iniciativas y proyectos de RELIAL en nuestras redes sociales, en el sitio web, sobre todo el concurso Libre Empresa, una oportunidad para apoyar a la sociedad civil a salir adelante y que juntos como activemos el futuro. Muchas gracias y nos vemos en redes sociales al Congreso de 2021.
Muchas gracias, Siegfried, por tus palabras de cierre. Por último, y como algo conmemorativo, queremos presentarles muy breve un resumen de algunas de las actividades que han realizado las organizaciones liberales por su cuenta. Este año, como ya lo hemos dicho, ha representado muchos retos, pero los liberales hemos sabido enfrentarlos y he aquí una prueba de ello. Naomi, ¿me apoyas, por favor, con el video?
Quedará para la historia el 2020 como el año de la pandemia. Lockdown, restricciones, miedo, incertidumbre y paro. Pero mientras se cerraban fronteras y se instalaban las cuarentenas, la libertad se abrió paso. En América Latina, diversos centros de investigación, think tanks y organizaciones liberales decidieron salir adelante. Se adaptaron a las circunstancias y, aprovechando las herramientas del mundo virtual, innovaron con seminarios, videoconferencias, cursos en línea, conversatorios, debates, campañas y entrevistas. Nada detuvo el potencial que inspira la libertad. La Red Liberal de América Latina, RELIAL, celebra el gran esfuerzo y labor individual de cada una de las personas que mueven y sacan para adelante las organizaciones. Son todas el ejemplo de trabajo y compromiso. Una vez más, los liberales latinoamericanos están demostrando fortaleza, ingenio y creatividad para desafiar cualquier adversidad. Los liberales tenemos la experiencia, los principios y los valores para no decaer y, por el contrario, para levantarnos y seguir defendiendo los derechos humanos, el Estado de Derecho, la economía de mercado, la libertad y responsabilidad individual. Estas son nuestras banderas para enfrentar los retos actuales y aportar por un futuro mejor. Queremos reconocer a la gran familia liberal que desde hace años se destaca por su compromiso e idoneidad, generando ideas y replicando buenas prácticas. Atravesamos un momento complicado, pero nada nos ha detenido. Aquí están las organizaciones liberales, aportando soluciones y reflexiones, demostrando que cualquier problema puede ser una oportunidad. El mundo se detuvo, pero la lucha por la libertad ha estado más activa que nunca. Les agradecemos el esfuerzo y la entrega por una Latinoamérica más unida en libertad.
Muchas gracias nuevamente a todos por ser parte de este primer Congreso virtual de RELIAL. Aquí nos despedimos y les deseamos que tengan un excelente día.